In the 1950s, workers began tearing down the patient wings of what had once been Chiswick House Asylum. To later visitors, it must have looked like routine clearance. Old institutional additions coming off an older estate. Brick by brick, corridor by corridor, the most visible traces of psychiatric life were stripped away. What remained was easier to admire. A graceful house, restored grounds, open vistas, a place that could once again be mistaken for beauty without function. But demolition has always been one of history's cleanest disguises, because when those wings came down, they took something with them. Not just beds, walls, or wards. They removed the part of the site that made its older purpose harder to romanticize and harder to ignore. The shell that survived looked gentler than the system that had once animated it. And that is exactly how certain institutions become unreadable. That is where this story begins. Not with madness, not with chains, not with the exhausted cliches people now attach to the word asylum. It begins with a building becoming easier to misremember, because the modern imagination hears that word and supplies the same picture every time. Confinement, coercion, locked doors, sedation, disappearance. The asylum, in popular memory, has become a machine of burial for people society did not want to see. And later, in many places, it often was. But the earliest layer of the story is harder than that, stranger than that, more dangerous, in a way, because it does not fit cleanly into the moral categories we inherited. Many early asylums were not first designed as cages. They were designed as therapeutic landscapes, placed on hills, surrounded by gardens, wrapped in farmland, walks, views, and carefully managed grounds, built not only to contain distressed minds, but to reorganize them through environment, movement, routine, work, air, prospect, and order. That does not make them innocent. It makes them much more interesting, because once you realize the landscape itself was part of treatment, the asylum stops looking like a passive container. It becomes a system, a building type that believed land, scenery, path, labor, and daily rhythm could do clinical work. And once that becomes visible, the official story starts to shrink. At first glance, that may sound almost impossible. The word asylum is one of the most emotionally contaminated words in modern history. It arrives preloaded with dread. Most viewers think they already know what it means before the first frame even appears. That is why this topic is so powerful, because the contradiction is built directly into the audience's mind. They expect iron bars. The architecture gives them gardens. They expect a prison. The site gives them vistas. They expect pure captivity. The historical plan gives them walking paths, agricultural work, recreation grounds, and carefully staged air. It is not that the darker story is false. It is that it is incomplete. And incomplete stories are often the most useful kind of lie. The 19th century, especially in Britain, saw the rise of new ideas about how mental distress should be managed. Some reformers rejected earlier brutality and promoted what became known as moral treatment or moral management. That language now sounds vague, even soft. But at the time, it meant something very concrete. A patient's surroundings mattered. Conduct mattered. Routine mattered. Work mattered. Order mattered. The institution was not supposed merely to restrain the person. It was supposed to reshape the world around the person in ways thought to support recovery. That logic changes everything. Because once environment becomes treatment, architecture is no longer secondary. The building matters. The grounds matter. The hill matters. The path matters. The view from the window matters. The distance from the city matters. The patient is no longer just inside an institution. The patient is inside a designed therapeutic environment. This is why so many early asylums were placed where they were. High ground, rural settings, landscaped estates, open land, space for exercise, supervised work, fresh air, and visual calm. Not because beauty alone was thought to cure, and not because these institutions were secretly benevolent resorts, but because the people designing them believed that distress could be acted upon through space, scenery, order, and habit. That is a chillingly ambitious idea, and it should sound familiar to your audience, because it belongs to a much larger pattern. Again and again, the old world seems to have embedded function in places we were later trained to read symbolically, sentimentally, or superficially. Hospitals built around light and air. Sanatoria built as climate machines. Sidewalks built as ceilings for buried workspaces. Institutions named softly after their harsher operational reality had already been hidden beneath language. The asylum fits this pattern perfectly. A word becomes a mask. A landscape becomes evidence. A later memory becomes too small for the structure that survived it. If you stand in front of one of these early sites today, especially one partially restored or repurposed, the first thing you notice is often not horror, it is order. A kind of measured calm. Long facades, repeated windows, grounds that do not feel accidental, paths that seem to invite movement while also defining it. Open space that feels less free than directed. Even the silence can feel designed. That is because it was. These institutions were often imagined as environments that could influence the mind by influencing behavior. Walk here, work there, sleep on schedule, see this view, breathe this air, stay within this rhythm. Recovery, in that model, was not expected to arrive purely through medicine. It was expected to emerge through disciplined life inside a managed setting. The landscape was not decorative. It was active. That is the hidden function. Not that the asylum was a secret paradise. Not that coercion was absent. But that many early asylums were built like machines for moral and emotional regulation through environment. And that is much harder to process than the usual haunted institution cliché, because it means care and control were fused from the beginning. That fusion is the heart of the story. The gardens were not simply there to comfort, they were there to guide. The work was not simply there to occupy, it was there to normalize. The walking was not simply leisure, it was regimen. The wide views were not simply pleasant, they were therapeutic in theory, disciplinary in practice, and institutional in structure. That is why the early asylum is so narratively powerful. It resists simplification. It refuses to become either a sentimental story of humane reform or a cartoon story of total oppression. It sits in the much darker zone, where a system believes it is helping by arranging the person's entire sensory and social world. That is a profoundly modern instinct. And once you see it, the asylum begins to resemble something far larger than psychiatry alone. It becomes part of a civilizational trend, the belief that institutions can reshape human beings by designing total environments around them. This is where the script should slow down and let the structure breathe. Picture one of these places as it would have functioned at its most self-confident. Morning light crossing ordered grounds. Patients walking along prescribed paths under supervision. Windows looking outward over carefully chosen views. Gardens maintained not merely for beauty, but for effect. Labor integrated into the daily program. Meals, rest, recreation, and conduct folded into one continuous regime. A house or block rising over the landscape like a promise of calm. And inside that calm, an entire theory of human repair. It is almost more unsettling than the later nightmare, because the later nightmare is easy to condemn. The earlier version is harder. It believed itself civilized. It believed itself therapeutic. It believed that a person's mind could be steadied, improved, or restored by shaping every surface of their lived world. And sometimes, compared with what came before, it probably did feel like progress. That is what makes the transition afterward so tragic. Because the public memory of the asylum is dominated not by its original self-image, but by what happened when institutions expanded, hardened, bureaucratized, and lost whatever balance they once claimed between care and control. As patient numbers increased, state systems thickened, and the social function of psychiatric institutions widened, the atmosphere changed. What may once have been presented as managed therapeutic order could become something much closer to warehousing, coercion, or long-term disappearance. One building type, two memories, and the later memory, one. That is why demolition matters so much in stories like this. When the patient wings vanish, when the more obviously institutional parts are erased, what survives is often the most photogenic part of the lie. The original villa, the elegant frontage, the estate, the landscape setting. Future generations can admire the beauty while no longer feeling the friction of the people who were processed through it. The grounds stay picturesque. The function goes dim. And once function goes dim, memory simplifies. That simplification works in two directions. On one side, heritage culture can polish the site until it becomes a story of reform, enlightened care, architecture, and gardens. On the other side, popular culture can flatten everything into gothic cruelty and haunted corridors. Both readings miss the mechanism. The mechanism was environmental. These places were built around the belief that one could administer recovery through arrangement. Arrangement of space. Arrangement of work. Arrangement of sight. Arrangement of daily life. Arrangement of contact. Arrangement of freedom itself. That is the point where the asylum stops being just a building. It becomes a landscape of managed behavior. And once it becomes that, the gardens no longer feel innocent. This is important because it restores seriousness to the architecture. Too often, discussions of old institutions focus on moral judgment alone. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it progressive? Was it cruel? Those questions matter, but they are not enough for a channel like yours. The better question is, what was it built to do? And once you ask that, The answer becomes sharper. The early asylum was built to regulate the person through a controlled world. Everything starts aligning once that sentence lands. The rural siting, the long drives, the symmetry, the workrooms, the airing courts, the farms, the gardens, the vistas, the daily routine, the careful separation between internal order and external social chaos. This was architecture doing psychological work, or trying to. And once architecture begins trying to do psychological work, it becomes dangerous in a uniquely elegant way. Not dangerous because it is obviously violent. Dangerous because it can look beautiful while still acting as power. Beautiful while still narrowing a life. Beautiful while still deciding what counts as healthy behavior, useful behavior, acceptable emotion, recoverable personality. That is a much more unsettling form of institutional force. It does not always shout. It organizes. It guides. It normalizes. It gives you a path and calls the path healing. That may be the deepest tension in the entire script. Early asylum landscapes can look humane precisely because they translated control into atmosphere. They replaced some of the visible brutality of older systems with order, beauty, routine, and managed openness. That is not nothing. It changed real lives. It likely eased certain forms of suffering, but it also reveals something fundamental about the 19th century, the growing confidence that power did not need to be ugly to be total. It could be gardened. It could be walked. It could be framed in a view. That is why these sites still feel uncanny, even in ruin. A ruined prison feels like collapse. A ruined therapeutic landscape feels like interruption. It carries the memory of a system that wanted to act on the soul through the arrangement of the world. And that memory is still there in the surviving shell. The house remembers. The grounds remember. The paths remember. The hill remembers. Even when the records thin out and the patient wings disappear, the land keeps a certain pattern. It keeps showing that the site was chosen, not found, designed, not drifted into, organized around an idea of what recovery should look like from the outside. That is what later generations were not supposed to notice. Because once you notice it, the word asylum becomes unstable. It stops meaning only refuge. It stops meaning only prison. It becomes a threshold term for a much stranger institution, a place where care, discipline, landscape, and social control were braided together so tightly that the building can no longer be read honestly through one moral lens. That is the wider pattern your channel should lean into. Old institutions rarely begin in the form by which they are remembered. They accumulate meanings. They harden. They are repurposed by later systems. Then history selects the phase that best fits modern emotion and calls that the whole truth. In the case of the asylum, the later phase was so disturbing that it swallowed the earlier one. But the earlier one did not disappear completely. It survived in the architecture, in the siting, in the treatment manuals, in the grounds, in the assumption that a patient should be placed inside an ordered world and changed by living within it. What was lost was not only the institution, it was the ability to read the institution's earliest design logic without collapsing it into the later nightmare. That is a subtler loss than demolition alone. It is interpretive loss. And interpretive loss is one of the central themes of everything your channel is doing. We inherit shells. We inherit labels. We inherit atmospheres. But not always the permission to read them correctly. So when you stand before a surviving asylum today, resist the first explanation. Resist both the sentimental version and the horror movie version. Ask a more useful question. Why was it built there? Why the hill? Why the gardens? Why the views? Why the farmland? Why the paths? Why the arrangement of movement and work? Why does so much of the site feel less like incidental beauty and more like a therapeutic program written into land? Because that is what it was. A program, a designed world, a controlled openness, a landscape expected to do institutional work. That does not redeem the asylum. It does something more interesting. It makes it legible. And once it becomes legible, it joins the rest of the buried system your channel keeps uncovering. The hospital that was more than a hospital. The sanatorium that was a climate machine. The foundling hospital that was an intake and transfer system. The sidewalk that was a ceiling for another city. The asylum that was not first a cage, but a therapeutic landscape built to shape minds through environment. That is the real revelation. Not that the old story was false, that it was too small. By the time the 20th century finished with these institutions, the harsher memory had taken over, and understandably so. But beneath that later darkness was an earlier design ambition that modern people rarely stop to examine. The belief that human distress could be managed by embedding treatment into landscape itself. That belief may have failed. It may have been compromised from the beginning. It may have carried paternalism and institutional arrogance in every brick. But it was real, and the buildings still show it. That is why the surviving sites feel so heavy. They are not just ruins of psychiatry. They are ruins of an environmental theory of care. They are the afterimage of a society that believed land, order, work, routine, and scenery could be assembled into a therapeutic machine. Then the machine hardened. Then the memory hardened with it. Then the original function was buried under the reputation of its final phase. And that is why this story matters. Because the asylum was never only the thing we remember. It was also the thing its landscape was built to do. The shell survived. The therapeutic world inside it did not.